Welcome to the 1600 Sessions, a podcast presented by the White House Historical Association. In each episode, White House Historical Association President Stuart McLaurin interviews luminaries, historians, and eyewitnesses to history about America's most famous residence and office, the White House. We open the doors to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue because it's not only the President's house, it's the People's House. In this episode, we'll be talking about one of the most dramatic events in White House history, the burning of the President's house in 1814 by the British.
The British fully intended this as a humiliation. It was a controlled burning. It was intended in revenge for what we had done in the city of York in Canada, and so they didn't just go wild and loot it, but they actually burned it.
The destruction of the White House represented a low point in our political relations with Great Britain, but its restoration during James Monroe's presidency demonstrated a high point of our cultural connections to France.
And I think James and Elizabeth Monroe both understood that, Paris in the late 18th and early 19th century is the cultural capital of the world. And in many ways, they wanted to emulate that, whether it was in his presidency or through furnishing the White House.
For the 200th anniversary of Monroe's moving back into the White House, Stuart McLaurin interviews White House Historical Association historians Edward Lengel and Matthew Costello about the British invasion and a French restoration.
Welcome to the 1600 Sessions. I'm Stuart McLaurin, President of the White House Historical Association. We're here today at the association's offices on historic Lafayette Square, just across the street from the White House, and today we're going to start by talking about one of the most dramatic periods of early White House history, the burning of Washington by the British in 1814 and its rebuilding over the next 3 years. This year, 2017, is the 200th anniversary of James Monroe moving back into the newly restored White House. And Monroe gives us an opportunity to talk about the French influence on early American culture and design in the White House. The current issue of our White House History Quarterly Journal is focused on these important connections between France and the White House. And there is also a symposium this month sponsored by the Association and the Embassy of France exploring this topic throughout our history. We're pleased to have two White House Historical Association historians here with us today to talk about these topics. Dr. Edward Lengel is the association's chief historian, and he came to us having served as a professor at the University of Virginia and director of the Washington Papers. He's also an award-winning author who has written extensively on early American history and military history. Thank you for joining us today.
Delighted to be here.
We also have Dr. Matthew Costello, who is the association's senior historian. Matt comes to us most recently from Marquette University and also from the University of Virginia, where he also did important work on the Washington Papers. And Matt has also been a fellow at George Washington's Mount Vernon. Thank you for being here today, Matt.
Thank you, Stuart.
Ed, we're going to start this discussion about our connections to France by briefly revisiting our troubles with France's rival in the early 19th century, Great Britain. During the War of 1812, we were once again fighting England, and this was more than 30 years after the Revolutionary War. Can you give us a brief introduction to what this War of 1812 was about?
Well, sure. This was a time of global war. It was really a clash of titans in some ways, dating all the way back to the French Revolution of 1789, created this maelstrom of conflict in Europe and throughout the globe. And the two major countries and empires at war, of course, were France and Great Britain, as they had been for centuries. This had been going on for a long time. George Washington had tried very hard to keep us out of any type of a conflict with these two nations. But by the early 19th century, we were being drawn further and further into this conflict, mainly because of a few matters. One was the question of the right to sail the seas in peace and American commerce. The French and the British had both declared embargoes against neutral shipping to try to blockade each other, and then we tried to declare embargoes against them. That was a disaster in our own economy. The British were impressing our sailors. They were also encouraging Native Americans to attack us on the frontier. And so this sense of anger and bitterness against the British, and particularly in the high seas, built up further and further until simply we couldn't take it anymore by the time of the War of 1812. There were also American designs against Canada. And so the British viewed this war as an opportunity just to defend Canada. We viewed it as an opportunity to expand.
Matt, could you describe this young national capital of a fledgling country at the time of this war and at the time the British advanced on the city to burn it? And what was Washington, D.C. like at that time, and how prepared was this city to handle itself or to defend itself?
Well, Washington, D.C. back then was a far cry from the city it is today. There's a great description by Richard Rush, who describes it to John Adams as a meager village of a few bad houses and extensive swamps. And this description actually is pretty astute to describe the nation's capital at the time. There weren't many permanent buildings. It was sparsely populated, very pastoral, a lot of farming, and namely the two major buildings, the Capitol building and the President's House. I mean, these really stuck out as these massive structures of the federal government, of the nation's capital, but they dwarfed pretty much everything else in the city. Now, as far as defensive preparations, part of what Thomas Jefferson had done as president, he had feared this idea of a standing army, of growing the American Navy, and he had put in substantial cuts to these two different types of defense. And when war rolled around under James Madison's term, the city was very vulnerable to invasion. And I think most people assumed that an enemy wouldn't come to Washington, D.C. because there wasn't much here to destroy. But I think the British understood that this was more a symbolic heart of the nation, and that's why they attack it that summer in 1814.
So Ed, take us back to that fateful day, August 24th, 1814, and how did the British come to actually advance on the city of Washington?
Well, the American Secretary of War, John Armstrong, had been convinced that the British were going to head for Baltimore, which, as Matt said, was a much more significant city at the time. So we were completely unprepared. We gathered a small force of 6,000 or 7,000 troops who were mostly militia, a few regulars from the Army, Navy, and Marines at Bladensburg. James Madison appeared there and wanted to watch the proceedings. There was a sense of overconfidence we would be able to beat the British, but the British forces were composed of veterans of the Napoleonic Wars in the Peninsula, and they were very disciplined and very effective. They beat the Americans at Bladensburg. It was really a rout. They called it the Bladensburg Races because it wasn't really a battle. They fled in disarray. James Madison had to flee, as well as all of his staff. Washington was thrown into a panic. People fled at the last moment. The White House was abandoned largely. A dinner setting was placed there, and actually food was placed on the assumption we were going to beat the British. Talk about overconfidence. So the food was left there on the table. The residents of Washington, D.C. were thrown into a panic. In fact, it was the Americans who looted the White House. American local residents came in. They saw it was unoccupied. They carried away silver. They carried away all kinds of artifacts which have been scattered. But then Dolly Madison appears. She's aware that the British are coming. She's very concerned at trying to preserve something. She gathers up some documents in a trunk. She pulls down some red velvet curtains, a few items of silver, but she focuses on the portrait of Washington, the famous portrait of Washington that's hanging on the wall. And she directs two helpers to pull it down from the wall. They actually had to break the frame in order to get it off and have it carted away.
In a previous episode, we did go more deeply into that story of Dolly Madison saving that famous portrait of Gilbert Stuart, and that is actually the only original item back in the White House today that was in the White House prior to the fire. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
There are a couple of other objects that are repurposed from the fire that reappeared, but not in the exact form that they did when they were in the White House prior to the fire. Tell us about those.
Sure. So there was some French wallpaper from the time the Madisons were living in the president's house. And some of that wallpaper was later repurposed for a tea box that was given to Benjamin Henry Latrobe's wife by Dolly Madison afterwards. Latrobe, he's famously known as the Capitol's architect. He also designed the very building that we're sitting in today, Decatur House. And he also did some inside interior work for Jefferson at the president's house before the burning. There's also this fantastic story as Jean-Pierre Soussan and the White House workers are pitching through the White House. They're trying to find anything that could be salvaged. And as they start throwing a lot of these damaged and melted objects into a gully just south of the house, there's this instance where Dolly Madison and Elizabeth Monroe are walking, and they find this great piece of glass. And they take the glass and they repurpose it into two matching shaving mirrors. And these are designed out of mahogany, the American Empire style. And it's believed that one was for then President James Monroe and outgoing President James Madison. Today, they're at the James Monroe Museum in Fredericksburg, and another one is at James Monroe's Ashland Highland.
The burning of Washington and these two wonderful buildings in this young city of the Capitol and the president's home was clearly a disaster at the time. But when we look back on the War of 1812, somehow it seems to have been a success for us. And how did that war affect President James Madison and the next president, James Monroe, both at the time and in how we look at them today?
The British fully intended this as a humiliation. It was a controlled burning. It was intended in revenge for what we had done in the city of York in Canada. And so they didn't just go wild and loot it, but they actually burned it and the Treasury building and the Capitol. So it was clearly a large national humiliation. And you would think under any other circumstances, Madison's reputation would have been destroyed. He was unprepared. He was there when it happened. He had to flee ignominiously. But there was a great deal of spin at the end of this war, partly because of Andrew Jackson's victory at the Battle of New Orleans was very timely, even though it took place after the peace had already been signed, but before word got to the United States. That allowed Madison to kind of present the war as a great victory. And James Monroe participated in this. And there was a popular sense that we had beaten the British again, that we had a great future in front of us. And ironically, we came together in what is known as the era of good feelings. When Madison left office and James Monroe came in as president, he was the most acclaimed president since George Washington. And even his second term, he was essentially unopposed. So we were able to overcome this sense, and the rebuilding of the White House became symbolic of our new optimism and our new hope.
Ed, tell us a little bit more about the decision to rebuild the White House and the Capitol. Was there talk of actually moving the capital city as after it was left in this ash heap?
There was talk of possibly moving the Capitol back to New England or potentially moving it inland, but Washington, D.C. still was the product of a delicate balance. It was located where it was because of a deal that had been struck in 1790 between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, the only deal those two guys ever were able to make with each other. And it represented a unity between North and South, a location that would bring Americans together, that would neither be too New England or too South, and it would also be at an entryway via the Potomac to the West. And so any attempt to have moved the city somewhere else would have upset that balance and would have divided us politically. So in fact, the decision to keep the city where it was one of the sources of that era of good feelings, of our ability to move forward and to reconstruct it as it was rather than completely demolish the building, but to try to rebuild from the remaining walls.
And it took 3 full years to rebuild the executive mansion at the time, and that means that Madison finished his presidency and Monroe began his presidency in houses other than the executive mansion. Matt, where were those buildings, and are they still here in Washington today?
So the Madisons temporarily were housed in what's kind of known now today as the Seven, but later they set up permanent residence at Octagon House, which is about a half a mile from the White House today. You can still visit it, and we have to sort of imagine what it was like for the Madisons to be able to look out and see the recently burned White House and sort of what could have been with the end of the war. And they would stay there until Madison finished up his term. And the Monroes would actually move into a house over on I Street, the Caldwell House. And James Monroe and Elizabeth Monroe had lived there during his time as Secretary of War and Secretary of State. And then they extended their stay after he became president in 1817. The Monroes would live there temporarily until the White House was ready to occupy them.
Ed, who oversaw the rebuilding of the Executive Mansion, and were they able to salvage anything?
Well, fortunately, they were able to bring back the original architect, James Hoban, who was able to oversee the reconstruction of the White House. They did not demolish it. Fortunately, in many ways, that was a symbolic decision, but it was also sort of a rush job. It needed to be done according to a schedule. It needed to be done with a limited budget. And so, in some ways, the materials that they used and the wood that they used in order to rebuild the walls and rebuild the interior were not really set to endure for centuries, and that would come to affect the White House. And when Teddy Roosevelt decided to renovate the White House in 1902, and he brought in a company under a gentleman named McKim, they partially gutted the interior, but he tried to truss up the walls with steel braces and steel trusses that were attached to this old wood and this cheap pine wood that had been used in the reconstruction of the White House. And it was not able to stand the strain. And within a few decades, this wood was splintering, the structural integrity of the White House was gone. And famously, Harry Truman's daughter, Margaret, when her piano fell through the floor, that was some indication that there were problems with the structure. So the reconstruction of the White House from 1948 to 1952 dated right back to the reconstruction of the White House under James Monroe.
So are there any remnants of that fire still today at the White House?
If you visit the White House, you can see in certain places, particularly in the basement, the original scorch marks from the fire.
Matt, you actually have made a fascinating discovery from your own research at the National Archives. Tell us about what you discovered of President Monroe finally officially moving into the White House.
So part of that question is sort of loaded because we have to determine what it means to officially move in. We had several dates to pick from, and keeping my eyes open while I was in the archive, I at least found something that I think adds a little bit more context to that story. So what we know is that President James Monroe, after he was inaugurated, he was in Washington, D.C. at the Caldwell House until the end of May. Then he embarked on a 15-week tour of the northern states. Now, Monroe did this in part, as I'd mentioned earlier, because of this fever pitch of nationalism that comes out from the end of the War of 1812, but also James Monroe really wanted to get to know the American citizen and the American communities across the entire country, not just in Washington, D.C., in New York, and Philadelphia. So he goes to Massachusetts, out to Detroit in the west, then he'll circle back to Washington, D.C., and he arrives here back in the nation's capital on September 17th. You know, according to contemporary accounts, newspapers, we had always kind of assumed that September 17th was the date that James Monroe officially moved back into the White House. There was a ceremony. The mayor of Washington, D.C., Benjamin Orr, was present. The Marine Band played. And essentially, this delegate of citizens escorts James Monroe from the boundary of the district to the Executive Mansion. What we later found out is that James Monroe only spent about 5 days. And then, upon my discovery in the archive, I found a receipt for James Monroe's house rental, which actually is dated October 3rd. So we know that James Monroe at least spent a few nights in the new White House. He then went back to reunite with his family at Ashland Highland, and he wouldn't be back in Washington until October 21st. But we know his possessions, and a lot of these possessions we've returned to the White House today as part of our work with the association. Those would have been moved October 3rd to the president's house.
Clearly, Monroe needed to completely refurnish the White House. All of the furniture had been taken or destroyed in the fire. And so he and First Lady Elizabeth Monroe were instrumental in bringing a French style into the White House through their furnishings and entertainment. And why were they such Francophiles? Why the strong interest in France and things related to France?
Well, James Monroe had served as the American minister to France between 1794 and 1796. He had gone back to Paris to negotiate the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. And I think James and Elizabeth Monroe both understood that, Paris in the late 18th and early 19th century is the cultural capital of the world. It's really seen as the language of the most cultured people. And they spoke French fluently, even at home with their children. And I think they also understood that at that time France was a powerful nation, a nation to be respected, and in many ways they wanted to emulate that, whether it was in his presidency or through furnishing the White House.
Well, since there was no White House Historical Association at the time, how did the Monroes go about getting those new furnishings and paying for those?
So James Monroe had actually secured an appropriation of furniture fund of $20,000 initially. As it turns out, not only was he taking some of the French objects and furniture that he had bought during his time abroad and moving those into the White House, but he wanted to supplement those with additional works. Perhaps most famously is the 53-piece of Belanger furniture. What we later found out is that this furniture was not only incredibly expensive to make, but also to ship. This furniture order alone cost somewhere around $18,000. So as you can imagine, Monroe was pretty surprised to find out that his agents in Paris, who were procuring some of these things, were spending such massive amounts of money. But luckily, he was able to get a supplementary appropriation from Congress to help refurnish the White House.
And today, many of these acquisitions are funded privately through the work of the association, and that's a privilege that we have enjoyed since Mrs. Kennedy's founding, or inspiration of our founding back in 1961. Ed, tell us a little bit more about the historical significance of turning to France for the new interior of the White House.
Even though France had been defeated with the fall of Napoleon after the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, France still was one of the most important countries, not only in Europe and the world, and French culture, French arts, French philosophy and thought were still dominant. French was still the language of diplomacy. So for James Monroe to outfit the White House in a French style showed that Americans were no longer thinking of themselves as backwoodsmen, as identifying themselves with Native Americans, but that they were very much on the global stage, that they saw themselves as equals of the Europeans in culture. And we were also identifying ourselves with the French in the sense that we have this great heritage with France of alliance. We still saw the British in some ways as our natural foes.
So, Matt, at some point, this strong interest in acquiring things French faded, and now today we focus on a great American craftsman of furniture and great American artists and their works, decorative arts. Did there come a time when there was a stronger interest, or perhaps even Congress, an interest on behalf of Congress, in buying things American?
So James Monroe was an exceptionally popular president, and I think members of Congress didn't really want to approach this issue directly with him in the White House. What they actually did was they waited until 1825, and they passed a law that year that determined that any furniture that is placed in the president's house should be American manufactured. And I think that's very reflective of the times, because in the 1820s, we're about to see the rise of Andrew Jackson, of the common man, and really I think Americans are starting to discover their own sense of national identity. And what we'll see through Jackson, even though Jackson does acquire many French objects as well, this sort of comes to a head during the time of Martin Van Buren being in office. There's criticism about his luxurious dinners and all of his pillows and tassels and curtains. But as it turns out, a lot of what Van Buren is using is French-inspired things that have already been in the White House. But really, I think that election between Van Buren and Harrison, it becomes a major point of contention, and Americans resoundingly reject that form of style in the White House.
You mentioned the 53-piece suite of Belanger furniture. that the Monroes brought into the executive mansion, and that was placed into a room and a space in the White House that has a little bit different name now than it did. Tell us about what that room was called at the time and what it is called today and how that change occurred.
Sure. So the room you're talking about today is the Blue Room. It is the oval-shaped room on the south side of the White House on the state floor. Now, this room has gone through many different names and many different designs. We've seen it referenced as the elliptical saloon, the oval saloon, the oval drawing room, but usually there's some indication by the shape, so we know that this is the room they're talking about. During Monroe's time, it was actually, to match the Belanger furniture, it was outfitted with a crimson red color. And it stayed more in that red motif until 1837. It's actually during the presidency of Martin Van Buren that it develops more of a blue satin feature in the reupholstery, and then blue curtains as well. And that's when the name Blue Room sort of starts to stick. And what we'll see with succeeding presidents is many of them do not deviate very far. In fact, they'll just try different shades, different types of furniture, but really blue has stuck around since 1837.
You mentioned Monroe's time in Paris as our minister to France, and he had some specific interest in what he wanted this furniture to be made of, and his request to the furniture makers back in Paris. He wanted it made out of mahogany and to feature our national bird, the eagle. But that didn't happen, did it?
No, it did not. As it turned out, the agents could not get a hold of mahogany. There was, just in terms of pricing, the international wars that were going on between France, Great Britain, and Spain, it would have been very hard to harvest this from Central or South America and get it back and have the furniture makers make it. Instead, what they decided to do was carve it out of beechwood and use a gilded paint to make it look perhaps more regal than it really was. But it still was a stunning set of furniture. As far as the eagles go, the eagle being our national symbol, and I think Monroe was probably happy that it was an eagle instead of Franklin wanted the turkey. I can't imagine that would have looked nice on the Belanger furniture.
Imagine, no.
But there was a problem. In France, Louis XVIII had essentially outlawed the symbol of the eagle because the eagle was a symbol of Napoleon. France is kind of going through their own internal political turmoil and trying to sort of erase some of those symbols and icons that Napoleon used so effectively.
There's another very elegant piece from this period that was brought into the house by the Monroes, and we know it today as that beautiful plateau that can be seen frequently on the state dining room table, the long table that stays in that room. Tell us about that piece.
We've attributed it to Derrière et Matelin, which would have been a Paris bronze maker. What's particularly fascinating about it is that this is an incredibly massive centerpiece. You're talking about 14 feet in length when it's fully extended. It has mirror surfaces as well that are going to reflect up in terms of flowers, condiments, whatever else is placed on there. But it really is, I think, very symbolic of Monroe's White House diplomacy. You can imagine James Monroe entertaining foreign heads of state and diplomats and luminaries around this particular piece. And they certainly would have been impressed with such a well-crafted and handmade piece from Paris. And the fact that, I mean, just the size alone, it's pretty incredible.
Ed, as you know, one of the ways that we work with the White House now is the acquisition of new presidential china. And the Monroes actually also had their own official presidential china that was made in France. What can you tell us about that china?
Monroe was the first president to have china made specifically for his administration. So he had both a dinner set and a dessert set of about 53 or so pieces. The dessert set, at least, we know what that looked like. It did have an eagle on it, bearing a shield with the words E pluribus unum on them, as well as different vignettes around the border depicting things like agriculture and science and power and all of the rest. So the dessert set has largely been preserved, and many of those pieces are still in the White House. The dinner set has unfortunately largely been lost.
Matt, there was a very famous Frenchman that we all know and respect who actually may have used this china during Monroe's presidency. Tell us who that was.
Sure. Well, that's the Marquis de Lafayette. He's sort of considered the French George Washington to many Americans. Lafayette had come over, even though he was born a noble, an aristocrat, he enlisted to fight in the Revolutionary War here. And his service really catapulted him in the minds of Americans as a friend of liberty and a friend of America. And when he returns in 1824, he'll actually be hosted for two White House events. One is in October 1824. He'll actually have dinner with James Monroe, and then he'll come back before he departs for France, and he'll actually be there for his birthday celebration, which is September 6, 1825.
And of course, for that visit of Lafayette, the President's Park was renamed Lafayette Square, which is out the windows from where we sit today. But the French influence went beyond just the furniture and these relationship and French connections. Elizabeth Monroe brought a bit of change to the social events at the White House as well, drawing upon her inspiration from her time in France and in the European courts. What was Elizabeth Monroe like as a First Lady?
Well, you also have to keep in mind there's a pretty big transition between Thomas Jefferson and how sort of White House hospitality worked under him, and how James Madison and Dolly Madison sort of continued many of those things. But then Elizabeth Monroe changes a lot of that because she is more familiar with European nobility, the royal courts. She's a firm believer that there are certain rituals and customs that should be designed to show deference. I mean, you are talking about the President and the First Lady of the United States. And part of what she does is she integrates some of that into introductions, seating, all of these things that would have been much more informal under Jefferson's time or under Madison's time.
The French influence on the White House extended to other areas, including hospitality, service, the staffing culture at the time. Give us a little insight into that.
Well, it really begins with Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson brings a lot of this stuff to the White House, and he really changes how the White House operates from how John Adams had it. He does away with a lot of these presidential levees. He's much more informal in his dress and in his mannerisms. And he even has his guests serve themselves with dumbwaiters, which was pretty unheard of at the time for Americans. But for the French, this would have been acceptable. So because the French were recognized for their excellence in hospitality and hosting, naturally it made sense that Jefferson would have a French chef, a French steward, and that this tradition would actually continue up until the Civil War through a series of French culinary experts, hospitality experts, until about the 1850s.
So add all of this beautiful French furniture that was brought in by the Monroes, was there when they lived there, obviously, and much of it is back in the house today, but that hasn't always been the case. It hasn't been there this whole time. Tell us what happened to that furniture over time.
Well, inevitably, the furniture, no matter how beautiful, it wears out. And the upholstery on the beautiful Belanger suite eventually wore out. People sat on them. They were nice pieces of furniture. You like to sit on them. During James Buchanan's presidency from 1857 to 61, he disposed of much of the Belanger furniture. And succeeding presidents over the remainder of the 19th century, it wasn't that they didn't care. It wasn't that they were casual about it, but each of them inevitably wanted to bring their own style to reflect their approach to the presidency. And there was simply no room for storage of much of this material. So much of it was sold off at auction. Some of it, unfortunately, was even thrown away from time to time. And it really wasn't until the early 20th century that there was this sense of loss and a sense of desire to recover some of that older influence in the White House. And famously, it was Grace Coolidge, Calvin Coolidge's wife, who decided to recreate an imitation Monroe room and bring in a lot of imitation Belanger furniture and the rest. But recovering all of that furniture and those items was a long, long process.
And up until President Kennedy in the early 1960s, a new president could come in and remove anything he wished to and replace it with more contemporary items or items to the taste of that president and first lady. Now we have a different standard. We have a museum standard in the White House, and there's a collection. Speaking of the Kennedys, there was one piece in particular that remained in the White House that was rediscovered by Mrs. Kennedy, I believe. Can you tell us about that?
Jackie Kennedy was such a remarkable woman in so many ways, and one of the new approaches that she took in the White House was not just to preserve what was there, and certainly not to create imitation furniture, but to actually recover and rediscover what had been there. So one day she was looking through an article that was in an architectural magazine from 1946, and she saw a reference to a pier table that was part of James Monroe's original suite, and she called up the chief usher at that time, who had been there since FDR, J.B. West, and asked him, well, where is this thing? Whatever happened to this? And he said, that's a good question. Let's try to find out. And so he searched around and discovered much of the old furniture had been moved out to a warehouse near Fort Washington in Maryland. And Jackie went over there with the chief usher and was prowling around, and she discovered up against a wall, lo and behold, the pier table. It was rickety, it was covered with dust, been used for all kinds of purposes in a carpentry workshop. It had old radiator paint gilt spread on it. Talk about an atrocity. But she ordered that this be brought back and restored. It was one of the great discoveries. There's a wonderful Life magazine from September 1st of 1961 with Jackie Kennedy on the cover. A beautiful, beautiful magazine, which talks about the pier table and talks about this new approach that she's taking toward bringing the White House back to what it had been and restoring it.
So today, the White House serves as the office to the president and his staff, the home to the president and his family, the ceremonial stage upon which our nation receives its most important visitors, but it's also a place where Americans from all over the country and visitors from around the world still have the opportunity to go through this home. And so, Matt, today, as visitors go through the White House, what do they see from this period that we are talking about? What are these items and artifacts that remain in the house today?
If you set foot in the Blue Room today, you may not even realize it, but a lot of these pieces that come from James Monroe's time in the White House have been restored and returned there. You can see pieces of the Belanger suite reupholstered in blue. You can also see the Hannibal clock on the mantle. And all of this, of course, is guarded by the portraits of Elizabeth Monroe and James Monroe that hang in the Blue Room as well.
What's the significance, Ed, of having this furniture from this period back in the house today?
Well, it's a living White House. It's not just a moment frozen in time like a museum, but it's a building that has carried us throughout our entire history. That each of the changes, each of the different elements of history, the different permutations the building has gone through, reflect a different stage in our process of growth as a nation. And being able to walk through the White House and being able to see all of these different phases, all of these different influences from different presidents and first ladies and countries really shows us for who we are and allows visitors to get such a better sense of the country as a living, breathing, growing country symbolized in that building.
I'd like to thank my colleagues, Dr. Ed Lingle and Dr. Matt Costello, for joining us today to talk about this very important period in White House history and our longtime connections to France and French culture and the French influence that we still see evidenced in the White House today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart.
And you don't have to wait for our next podcast to learn more about the White House and its history. You can visit our website at whitehousehistory.org.
You've been listening to the 1600 Sessions. This podcast is presented by the White House Historical Association and produced by Long Story Short Media. You can subscribe or download new episodes at the1600sessions.org, and don't forget to rate us on iTunes. You can also learn more about the burning of the White House and its restoration at whitehousehistory.org. Thanks again to Edward Lengel and Matthew Costello, and thank you to the U.S. Marine Band Library, which provided the music for this podcast.